Good morning, everybody, and welcome on Wednesday, the 25th of August, to the latest public assurance meeting. It's good to be here again with the next meeting where we'll be speaking to Chief Constable Chris Haward and Assistant Chief Constable Kerrin Wilson today about progress the force is making on tackling crime and other issues that policing has to do around the county. Before we go any further, we'll start with apologies. I know there are a few. Have you got a list there, Aubrey or Adam?
Yeah, I've got a list of apologies. We have apologies from ACC Chris Davison, Chief Financial Officer Sharon Clark, Deputy Chief Constable Jason Harwin, and Chief Executive for the OPCC Malcolm Birch.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll do a quick round of introductions so people will know who is here. I'm Mark Jones, the Police and Crime Commissioner for Lincolnshire, and I'll pass over to you, Chris.
Okay, sorry, just bear with me. I'm just trying to get the right papers up, Mark. Do you want the integrated performance part or the?
No, just running through a quick round of introductions. So just throwing it over to you to introduce yourself and Kerrin. And
apologies, working from 3 different screens this morning. So Chris Howard, Chief Constable.
And Kerrin.
Good morning, Kerrin Wilson, Assistant Chief Constable.
I can see we've also got somebody else from Forside with us today. So I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself, Lee.
Yeah, good morning. Lee St Quinton, Chief Inspector and formerly the Project Manager for the Forces Uplift, which is agenda item number 5 I'm joining for.
Thank you for joining us today. And Julie?
Morning, I'm Julie Flint. I'm the Chief Finance Officer to the PCC.
Aubrey?
Aubrey Williams, our Research and Performance Officer for the PCC.
Super. And certainly not least, but Adam, you're the last person on today.
And Adam Muspratt, Research and Performance Intern in the OPCC.
Brilliant. So thank you everybody for joining us today. So by way of an update, there was a particular area of business that I just wanted to give a bit of an update on. And this is around the Lincolnshire Women's Strategy. So through the Reducing Offending Group of the Safer Lincolnshire Partnership, which is chaired by Joe Davison, who is my Performance and Delivery Manager, the Lincolnshire Women's Strategy, which its aim is to support women and girls at risk of entering the criminal justice system, has been developed. A Ministry of Justice Women's Community Sector Core Costs Funding Grant was awarded to Lincolnshire Action Trust recently, who led on the work, and we're in the process of writing out to partners to invite them to commit to the strategy by signing a Lincolnshire Concordat. The terms of that Concordat reflect those of the Ministry of Justice-led National Concordat on women in or at risk of contact with the criminal justice system. The National Concordat gives effect to the objectives of the 2018 Female Offender Strategy, and the MOJ has signalled that at the end of 2021 it will be asking government departments to update it on progress towards achieving the outcomes required by the Female Offender Strategy. The Lincolnshire Strategy, supported by the Lincolnshire Concordat, is our way of updating on that progress. So we will be doing that. We've also supported a further bid from LAT to the Ministry of Justice to develop an underpinning delivery plan, and we're currently waiting on the outcome of that bid. But it's really important work as part of the wider strategy, both that we want to see delivered, but government wants to see delivered in developing strategies around women and girls at risk of entering that criminal justice process. So there's a lot of work going on there, and I just thought it was worth highlighting that particular area of business. The next item on the agenda is public questions, but I understand we don't have any this time round, Aubrey. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We've received no questions from the public for this public assurance meeting.
Okay, brilliant. So we'll go into the main focus report, item 5, which is the update on the Officer Uplift programme. So I'm not sure if I'm handing to you, Chief, or over to Lee, but I'll leave it to the force side to pick this up.
So I think I'm going to trot you through the where we're at, and Lee will fill in the details if I get it wrong or if there's any difficult questions. Lee is my backup. Position we're in since the last meeting, I think we made the decisions around where we were going to put officers, but the detail in how that was going to happen wasn't available at that time, obviously required some further planning. So we've now got to the position since the 7th of May where Lee and Pete Grayson have done a fantastic job in kind of mapping out where all this is going to take place. It's all gone into the capabilities board chaired by DCC Jason Harwin, and basically in terms of the officer uplift over the coming couple of years, it's now broken down into 5 phases. The first being between July this year and October this year. The second phase, November 21 to April 22, and this all coincides with when our cohorts come in and our officer uplift numbers actually happen. There's a very short phase between May 22 and June 22, again linked into when people become available, and then phase 4, July next year to October, mirroring basically what we've got this year, and then the 5th phase again mirroring phase 2, November 22 to March 23. And what that does is it breaks down where the officers are going to be placed and in what numbers over those phases. So if you remember that we basically gone through lots and lots of business cases and requests for additional officers and broken those down into successful bids. Those were mapped against the management of risk in law enforcement morale scoring data, as well as our gap analysis based on the force management statement, independent scrutiny by the independent advisory group, the gap analysis of the force and current issues we're facing, as well as our senior commanders' professional views around force priorities and the importance of some of these. So there is a very complicated risk matrix that scores where all of the resources needed to go. And as a result of that, the successful bids that came out of this were firstly into neighbourhood policing, where we've authorised a further 12 PCs, and I'll come back to the timeline of this in a moment. We have a dedicated roads policing unit being created, which will be an uplift of 18 constables and 2 sergeants. And then we've obviously got some capital expenditure around that to provide vehicles, equipment, training, and everything you need to get a new unit up and running. And then in local policing, so into response, there'll be 53 additional posts. Although on the paper I've got, it doesn't show me the breakdown of constables and sergeants, but off the top of my head, I'm going to say that was 47 constables and 6 sergeants. And I'm sure Lee will correct me in a moment if I've got that wrong. We're investing further into the protecting vulnerable people, but particularly in the paedophilia online investigation team. So POLIT, with an additional detective sergeant and 6 additional DCs. Rationale behind that, although it's not uniform response and uniform visibility, is the demand in that area has gone up by 53% in the last 3 years and continues to increase. And we know that there's some significant risk against sitting in there. We've also got increasing demand in the digital field around digital forensics. So there'll be an additional 2 DCs that go into that team. And then one of the more sensitive areas, and I know has created some community noise around this and tension, was our lack of a rural crime action team. So we will be creating a rural crime action team, and that will consist of 8 constables and 1 DS. On the paper I've got, it shows detective constables, but I think that's going to be a mixed economy of response and investigative skills as well as a DS. But that will also be supported by 6 special constables. So that team will effectively be 14 constables plus the sergeant leading. So in terms of timelining of all of this, the proposal linked into the police officer uplift programme and when they come in is that for response, 16 of those will be in place at the end of phase 1, so that's by the end of October this year. A further 20 of them will be put in place in phase 2 up to April 22 next year, so within the next effectively 9 months we should have 36 of them in place, and then the balance will come in phase 4 and phase 5. So by the end of this we'll see the full 53 effectively in place and deployable by March 23. So that takes into account recruitment, training, and then their deployments into teams and their probationary periods. Roads Policing Unit effectively will be in phase 2 from November this year. So we've currently got adverts going out and the recruitment process has begun, but it's going to take time to recruit people with the right skills. But 10 of those officers will be in place between November and April next year. And then in phase 4, we'll get the additional 10 coming in, again linked to when new recruits come in, so we can release more experienced officers who have got the skills and experience into those teams once we've got the backfill coming through in the officer uplift numbers. Digital forensics will be in phase 2, so that recruitment will start very soon. And then the rural crime action team, we're trying to prioritise in phase 1 to get at least 5 of those 8 constables in post ready for October, because we know that there's going to be an uplift, and we hope to have the sergeant in place as well. And then the additional 4 will come in phase 3, May 22 onwards. And the reason again behind that is just logistics and waiting for new officers to come through. Pollitt, so the paedophilia online will be phase 2 and phase 3 predominantly, so that will be 5 of them in by June 22 and the remaining 2 by October next year. We do have 10 that need to go into the regional organised crime unit, and they'll be mapped through for phase 2 and phase 5. As you know, Commissioner, the balance of the ROCU staffing will happen at the end of the police officer uplift. So 7.5 of those posts effectively won't happen until the back end of 22 and into early 23. And then on top of the roles we've already spoken about, we have identified 4 permanent project roles. The reason for doing this is when we look at our abstraction levels on a year-on-year basis, we normally have at least 4 people abstracted from their day-to-day job to deliver projects on behalf of the force. So we've taken the decision to make sure that they're established posts so that we're not constantly begging and borrowing from response teams, but we have a much more structured approach to project management and project implementation. And we will continue to support a Chief Inspector partnership role, which has been in place for some time but hasn't been on our established books. So we'll create that post as well. So by the end of phase 5, that will see an officer uplift of 118. 26 of those will be in place by the end of October. 40 or 39.5 will be in place by the end of phase 2, April 22. And then the balance will come through phase 3, phase 4 and phase 5 as new recruits come online. So that's a very quick run through of all the work that Lee and the team have been doing. Apologies, there's no paper for the public to see, but some of the data in this is quite sensitive. It talks about our operational resilience and capability, and would not be suitable for public consumption. So if I pause there and open up to questions, or allow Lee to come in and correct anything that I may have said if I've misinterpreted it anyway.
Thanks for that, Chief. Lee, do you want to come in there?
I can probably just top up a few areas. The Chief talked about the split in the response officers moving forward. What we've actually done with that is try to give the Chief Superintendents a little bit of flexibility there to put in place exactly what they need in relation to that split and not be too prescriptive. So we have given some recommendations. We are allowing divisions to really do what they feel they need to do to police their community better. I was just going to mention the underpinning principles to this work as well. which I think is really important. So one of our key objectives really was around making sure we safeguard our frontline response teams and making sure that when we create our new teams within Lincolnshire, we don't leave our frontline response teams vulnerable to that demand. So part of that principle is to make sure we really look after our frontline response teams and make sure that there's growth in those areas early in this plan to make sure we can create our new teams such as our road policing team. We also factor in complex training needs. All of these departments have different levels of training needs. Roads policing again have some complex ones, as do our polit team. So we've made sure our plan runs in line with the availability of training. The timeliness of some of these, the Chief mentioned our rural crime action team, and we've looked at that plan carefully and made sure that we can put that team in place, or certainly part of that team in place, so it has a real effect this calendar year. It'd be very, it wouldn't be the best for us to introduce that team when the rural crime window closes. Put that in place early. And finally, we've also reflected in our plans the current HR picture around some retirements in force and when we need to act to put people in place and really get that benefit to make sure we don't have any gaps in service in some of our departments as well. I hope that just clarifies a few things, but that's it for me, I think.
No, thank you for that. And I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be talking about what we're going to do with a little bit more, rather than where we're going to reduce something because we've got a little bit less. So it's an unusual situation for Lincolnshire to be in that position. It's really nice to see. But I think what we're doing today is really explaining how difficult it is, because you can't just move somebody, you leave a gap. And obviously one of the challenges that's always going to be there is you can move a person, but then it's and the question I would put to you is around, well, once you move the people, what kind of training requirement do we have? What kind of lead time will there be between moving a person from job A to job B and bringing them up to speed with what their skills and role will be? And also, as a separate thing, is the capital expenditure around that. Obviously, if you're building a roads policing team, there's an obvious capital expenditure in the vehicles they'll need. The same with the rural team, they will need certain kit that so obviously we want to make sure that kit's available as soon as possible when the team's formed. So it's just really to understand the planning around that side of it, as well as the training, if possible, please.
Yeah, so good questions, Commissioner, and they are things that we're still working through, and I'll let Lee come in a moment because I know they're doing a lot of work around this. But the training requirements for roads policing, for rural crime, is all being worked through at the moment. Rural crime probably concerns me less than roads policing, because a lot of it's going to be fairly generic response policing and neighbourhood policing and investigation. Roads policing is very specialist and high risk training as well. So there's driver training as well as fast roads training, and we're just mapping that through. Sharon Clark, my Chief Finance Officer, is working through the capital requirement as well, about what that's going to look like, not just in terms of vehicles, but our estate cost and where that's going to be. Because if we look at PVP and Polit, not only do they need an uplift in numbers, but they're crammed into a very small space in a corridor at headquarters, and we need to do something to improve where they're working from and create the space for those additional officers to come in and to work safely from in a healthy environment as well, where they can take appropriate breaks from what they happen to be looking at online. So all of that is being worked through at the moment. It's very, very complicated. So whilst some of these teams will be created in those phases, there will still be significant training requirements that come beyond that. Lee, do you want to come in with a little more on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing I would say is the full implementation that we've designed has now been handed over to that capabilities board under the direction of the DCC. All of those areas that you've mentioned are being worked through currently. In relation to that training, what I would say is, as part of the initial scoping that we did with the wider business, we worked very closely with our senior leaders to understand what they would like to see, but also what the impact that would have on the organisation. So from really early on, we scoped exactly what that impact would be, whether that be a capital expenditure for vehicles, but also the estates and the training. And what you see in the implementation plan for these officers is, and roads policing is a good one, where we phase the approach of that department to make sure we can adequately train those officers. And that model has come direct from the senior leadership team in the central ops team, who have told us how they can train those officers in the best way and in the most cost-effective way, importantly. And the increase of 10 and 10 is seen as the best and most cost-effective way of training those.
Okay. Other question I've got is, it sort of sits alongside really, because one of the other advantages that policing has is that it's got a large core of very able, active volunteers in the special constabulary, and whether I know we've talked for a number of years really about the advantages of specials, not just specials that can obviously do the traditional work, and we've seen a bit of that with the Safer Roads team, which has been really successful and obviously is a special led project. And I just wondered whether that again was something that you were looking to build into the new teams. Particularly I'm thinking probably rural team, where you might have people of a rural background that volunteer. Is that likely to emerge as a way of bolstering the numbers further?
Yeah, so Commissioner, I agree with that. I think it's an ambition rather than a priority at the moment. The main reason for that is that we will have a significant amount of training to get through for our regulars, but we're also suffering with a little bit of a backlog in training because of COVID, particularly where we're looking at specialist training and driver training and so on and so forth. But certainly it would be my ambition that we see more volunteers and specialist volunteers and those similar to the specials, you know, that have that training that can work alongside these teams. But it's just a question of scheduling those and sequencing them alongside everything else that we've got to achieve. I think ACC Wilson's got a hand up and would like to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. Just in relation to the specials, and just to give you a bit of a view of the lead-in time for even the ambitions, if we get somebody who joins today to be a special in a specialist area, they've still got a 2-year programme to go through as a special, and a national portfolio that they need to complete to give them the same level of training and warranted powers that you would expect a professional to have, even though they are a volunteer. So even if we said yes today and we turned on that tap, it would still take them another couple of years to get through to go into those specialist arenas, because we'd want to give them the best training that we could. So just to give a little bit of a reality of what that might look like even when we do get there.
No, thank you for that. And you know, obviously, I know it's always going to be one of those challenges, because you can only train so many people, and clearly the priority is going to be for full-time regulars. It has to be that way. I understand that, but I was just interested in how that might fit together into the future. Do you see, aside from the fact that we've obviously got a very clear plan there, and it's great to see that yeah, there is a clear pathway and timescale for that. Do you feel that there are relatively few bumps in that road as we go along? Is there a fairly high level of comfort that that's an achievable timescale, or is there anything that you think is likely to be problematic that we need to be aware of?
So I think it's achievable. Lee may come back and shout at me for this, saying it's achievable because he's got all the work on it. I think the challenges we've got is obviously the G4S transition at the same time. We've got command and control replacement going on at the same time. We've got the transformation programme, and we've got our niche crime and intelligence systems that need to be upgraded and basically that's a regional issue. So it's not just about the police officer uplift, it's the amount of work that's going on in the background on other things, all of which is coming together. So the resources that are required in order just to manage that are quite high, and the time pressures that we're under for all of this are really, really tight. So it's that kind of, it's not quite a perfect storm, but it's not far off it in terms of everything colliding at the same time. But I think the plan that Lee and the team have put together, the fact that we've now got it into the 5 phases, the fact that we've already agreed with you, Commissioner, to accelerate some of the police officer uplift recruitment, which has helped because it means we can get more officers in more quickly and before we have to move to PEQF, because there's going to be a time lag when that happens. I think that all helps the programme. But it's then just turning that around and making sure, as you say, that we can't just take one officer out to put into rural crime and leave a gap behind. We need to make sure that we've got competent and fully fledged officers coming in to fill those gaps as we go through. But I think it's achievable, but it's going to be tough. You know, I'm under no illusion the next 6 to 9 months as we get through transition and we start phase 1, phase 2, or go through phase 1 and phase 2 and then get into phase 3 are going to be really, really tough for the force.
No, I think that context is really important because there is probably an unprecedented level of change going on across the force in different areas, and I think it's not easy for anybody external to see any of that, but it's certainly being felt by those that are doing the hard miles, sorting out internally, and the work that they're doing. You know, I'm very grateful for, and I would obviously pass on my thanks for that, and you know, we look forward to being in the position in a year's time when we can look back at some of that rather than having it all before us. But no, I haven't got any other questions around the Uplift programme at this stage. Whether anybody else has got anything to add before we move on? I'm seeing no hands, so thanks very much for that. Thank you, Lee, for covering that off as well. So we can move on to item 6. I don't know whether you're staying with us, Lee. You're very welcome, or whether you are going. I'll leave that to you to decide. But yeah, so I'll hand over to you then, Chief, the integrated performance report.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. So you've all got the report in front of you. Kerrin and I are going to do a bit of a double act here, provided I can remember which bits we agreed to share and which bits Kerrin was doing and which bits I was doing. So but in terms of where we are in terms of overall crime and demand, the summary is there on page 3. You'll see that predominantly that's green. Everything looks healthy. It is a 12-month rolling comparison. So we do need to factor in COVID and the impact that's had on some of our demand and some of the crime types. But across some of those, our position nationally has improved in a number of them. Although in terms of overall crime, we've remained static at 16th out of 43 in the country. And obviously our ambition is to push ourselves up to the top of that and be the safest county. But it's a positive picture, and we're comfortable with where we're at the moment. But as we start to go down into the tables, you'll see in terms of all crime, since COVID and lockdown has ended, there is a sharp spike and an upward trend. So I think we've now got 5 data points showing that upward trend. And this is not just something Lincolnshire are experiencing, it is happening nationally. It's taking us back to levels that we experienced 2 years ago. The question will be whether it does ease off over the course of the next 2 or 3 months and plateaus. We just don't know at the moment, because the demand that is coming through our call centre, which Kerrin will talk about in a moment, has remained stubbornly high, and is just pulling us all over the place at the moment. And then on top of that, as you're aware, we've had a number of very serious and critical incidents, and that just seems to carry on week after week at the moment, from murders and homicides to some fatal accidents, and then obviously the tragic incident with the caravan over the last couple of days. And those all drag our resources away in terms of responding to normal daily business. In terms of burglary, that continues to be a positive picture. Again, it's dropped off through COVID, and of all the crime types is the one that is staying relatively static and continues to be lower than we've seen previously. I think a lot of that is still to do with the fact you've got people working from home, and people really aren't going on overseas holidays and things like that. So houses are not being left unoccupied for periods of time, and therefore the vulnerability has dropped. Violence is an area that all forces are very concerned about at the moment. We're starting to see that rise and go back to previous levels. And I know that there's work in the force, which Kerrin will touch on later, around violence reduction and putting those teams together. And there's a lot of work to try and make sure that we're addressing this. And I know, Commissioner, that you're committing money towards the violence reduction piece, as well as the violence against women and girls. But that does remain a concern for us. It is not unique to Lincolnshire. There seems to be a bit of an explosion of tension as people came out of lockdown, and that level of violence has slowly crept, well, not slowly, has gone up quite sharply since lockdown ended. But again, nighttime economy has an impact on that, as well as the release of pressure and people coming back together. So we continue to monitor that, and there are a number of action plans through Andy Cox, our head of crime, to try and address that. Linked to that as well is sexual offences are rising again, still within our normal bounds, but you'll see there are 3 data points now that suggest that that trend is continuing upwards. Again, Andy Cox presented to the Chief Officer team this week our response to HMIC report on rape and sexual offences. 7 recommendations made in that report. We have a comprehensive action plan to address that, and some real improvements coming already, particularly in terms of victim care and victim referral. So I think our adult victim referral, if I'm right, has gone from 35% being referred into over 80% now being referred into victim services and victim care. So there's a growing level of confidence amongst our victims, but also improvements in service, and we hope that will start to knock on into improved outcomes and from the investigation, but also then start to bring under control that a growing culture, I think, that almost says that some of this behaviour is normal and acceptable in society, which it should never be. So big work going on there by Andy Cox and the team. Robbery remains pretty static, so I'm not going to dwell on that one again. I think some of that is related to availability of people on the streets and their vulnerability. And while people are still maintaining social distance and a lot of people staying inside, I don't think there's a huge amount of work to do on that until we see the impact of COVID over the coming few weeks and months and see whether it starts to pick up again. Drug offences you'll see is a positive picture, but again, it may be about availability of the population and changes in perspective and behaviours through the lockdown period. And then theft is a positive picture in terms of the reductions that we've seen over the past 2-3 years. And whilst we do see a drop in COVID periods, that is a trend that was going on way before COVID ever hit. And although we've now got a few data points showing a rise, we're still in the normal bounds. But we are looking at that through our performance board to see where these data trends are taking us, whereabouts in the county it's hurting us, and how we're going to target those. New control strategy for the force is in place, and it does prioritise a number of these crime types, particularly violence against women and girls and rape and sexual offences and violence. But it also prioritises some of the rural crime aspects as well within this. So we will start to prioritise our resources against a number of these, but that does mean that in some areas where we've got lesser crimes with less harm and less risk involved in them, we may not be providing as much service and attention to them as we previously have done, but we will be prioritising our resources against those areas of the highest threat, risk and harm, and making sure that we investigate those properly and prevent those people who cause that harm from doing so in the future, which then should, in all reality, have a knock-on effect to some of the lesser crimes and the lower level antisocial behaviour elements as well. So in terms of all of that, the final bit I'll say is that the crime harm index, which is it's a measure that classifies our crime against how harmful it is, you can see that because of some of the violent aspects of it, that crime harm index is starting to rise. And again, there's a sharp spike in the last 3 months. So that's the element that I want to get control of, because that's what causes our communities most problems and most harm. So if we can get on top of the elements that I've highlighted, then I think we'll get control of a number of these performance issues. So if I just hand over to Kerrin, she'll just talk about the Operation Unlock and our response since COVID restrictions were relaxed.
Thanks, Chief. So Operation Unlock, and we've rehearsed this, as you saw last year when we came out of lockdown in the summer, and we dusted those plans off and looked at what worked last summer and what was working this summer to make sure that we had the right resources in the right place. This meant that we've ensured that we've got additional resources to manage the nighttime economy. And that has been supplemented not just from the response officers and the normal uniform officers, but making sure that we've got some of the other support functions which might be in the background, such as our tech futures support, people who might be on projects also contributing to when we needed additional resources. So CID, PVP, etc. would also come and support that. And we're trying to make sure that we're not burning officers out, because we've had quite a number of significant events over this period of time as well. And it's making sure that we've got the balance right, because we can't wear people out, and we are getting lots of national requirements to come through to support things like Extinction Rebellion or football matches in other parts of the country. And we've got quite a tight grip on where our resources are going, so that when they do come back, they're not completely worn out and they can still continue to police the nighttime economy and the challenges that we have here. The plans have been going really well in terms of having the right number of resources. We've recently looked at a review of our partnership with a contract company that we have that do scene guards, and we're reboosting those so that we can free up officers who would ordinarily be on scenes to address some of the protection of those scenes, to have that outsourced elsewhere, so that those officers can be freed up to attend the jobs that they need to attend to. In the report, it does highlight that that a lot of our crimes are influenced by alcohol and drugs, but what you will see is that we have had quite significant operations on drugs, operations around trafficking. So we've had lots of newsworthy stories that have come out, but we've also got quite a number of people in the pipeline as well for criminal convictions, hopefully as they come through their trial processes of big operations where we've had traffic, drugs, county lines, etc. coming into this county from all across the country, and that takes an awful lot of resource, and the public don't always see that, but there's a lot of work going on in the background to try and tackle this and stem the flows that come in. What we have seen is a great take up when we've taken these operations on, take up of those referral services for drug users. So not only are we taking out the drug traffickers and stemming the flow of the drugs coming into the county, but we're also putting in place measures to give the support to users so that they're not looking for the next fix from somebody who's dealing on the streets. We're also looking at, and the Chief takes a very keen interest in this, in the officers who were assaulted on duty, and we have seen that rise. So that does actually impact on our officer, on the violence figures, and that has risen over the last several months. And again, this is a national picture which is being painted, where officers being assaulted, more robustly being managed within the workforce, so that we can get people back to work and give them the support that they need. Because if they're being assaulted and they're off the streets, then we don't have people who are able to come to the support of other people who need the service for the force that we get. And then just lastly, touching on the violence reduction unit, the Commissioner has agreed that he is supporting, although we're not going to get any national funding for a violence reduction unit, the Commissioner has agreed that he will support having an internal violence reduction unit, and there's work ongoing to how we set that up, looking across at partnerships. And at this moment in time, we haven't got that up and running, but hopefully on our next public assurance meeting we can give a bit more of an update on exactly where we are with that, if that's okay, Commissioner. All I will say just in relation to that particular piece is that we are making sure that this is fed across to lots of the other different funding streams as well, of violence against women and girls, etc., to make sure that we're not having competing demands but more complementing each other.
No, thank you for that. And I think on the last part first, I suppose one of the things that I'm keen to do, reducing violence has an impact on a range of service providers. So whether that is local government partners, health partners, we all have sort of a vested interest in reducing that, and I'm very hopeful that other partners would see value in working closely with us and potentially investing in that work, because it will save them money elsewhere as well as deliver better outcomes for residents. So that's something I'm keen that it's not just money that we're putting in, but it's a partnership approach to actually a longer term method of reducing violence and harm in the county. A couple of other questions from me. One of the things that you said, Chief, which I just want to, it's not me in any way being critical of, I just want to try and understand, was you were sort of talking about tackling the high-end harms as a way of them potentially reducing the lower impact crimes, which historically, normally the sort of broken windows approach would be to tackle the lower end as a method of preventing the higher end harm. So I just that's one of my areas that I'm sort of interested in your approach to that, because from a public perception point of view, most people would arguably say, well, if you tackle the antisocial behaviour, you prevent shop theft, you tackle that lower level crime, as it would generally be considered, that would prevent that gateway into other things. But it seems like the approach might be the reverse of that. The other element I just wanted to ask you about was particularly around burglary, where you're quite right, the results are Lincolnshire's always done very well really in this area of business, in fairness, and obviously if people aren't leaving the home, it's much harder for people to break in to homes. And we know probably a couple of years ago now the recording methods around this changed, which meant that suddenly if somebody breaks into 8 sheds in a street, they all go down as on these figures as well. So we've had some recording changes, but in particular we've seen 1 or 2 forces take a different approach, and it's been alluded to in the beating crime plan that the Minister has talked about, particularly around Northamptonshire, and I think now I want to say West Midlands, but I could well be wrong, but I think it's West Midlands, where they're talking about 100% attendance at residential burglary and the reduction that certainly had in Northamptonshire, and whether there's any learning in that for Lincolnshire, or whether we're already picking up on those things. So if I can hand back to you for those, that'd be good.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. I'll start with the first one around the high-end piece. There is merit in the broken windows approach, and I've seen that work. It's also something that you need to be doing the two in conjunction with each other. But I think the point I'm coming and the reason I'm coming from the high-end piece is, if you start to look at where the role models are in society and what's acceptable behaviour in society, and the increasing levels of violence and serious violence, the online element of it in particular, and what's acceptable and not acceptable, particularly in terms of sexual behaviour and sexual offending, those are the areas that need to be tackled, because actually we are seeing a very definite shift in what you and I might think would be acceptable and unacceptable behaviour to something that would probably stretch our own tolerances about whether something is or isn't acceptable. So it's tackling those areas and making sure that we're trying to reduce the high-end offending and some of the things that we see online in terms of what is or isn't acceptable, and what young people seem to accept themselves, either as, well, it wasn't a crime, it was just somebody touched me. Well, I'm sorry, but that isn't acceptable and should never be acceptable. And if you take the high-end drug supply as well and look at what the marketplace is and the availability of drugs, and some of the work that we've done recently that Kerrin has been leading on across the force for the last 5 or 6 months, actually trying to tackle that high-end drug supply and the organised crime groups behind it and those role models who are out there, and strip away those people. Not only does it take away the role models and says this isn't a profitable business, but it also has a knock-on impact to low-level theft, low-level antisocial behaviour, low-level assault, and potentially robberies. So if you can actually look at where the cause is rather than the symptoms, then you will have a higher and more sustainable impact. The problem, I think, with broken windows is that it tends to address the symptoms and doesn't go to the heart of what the actual problems are. So that's where I would come from on that one. The two need to happen together, because you can't allow the symptoms to continue while you try and treat the cause. You've got to try and mitigate both. But we need to focus our limited resources in the right areas to try and make sure that we are much more preventative and protective than we are about pursue, because all we're doing by pursuing is allowing the demand and the symptoms to grow and grow and grow, and we need to get control of that. So it's a little bit about turning a tanker around. It will take time, but that's where we need to be. In terms of burglary, I think it is really good performance. We do attend, I'm not sure it's 100%, but we attend most where it's appropriate to do so. We do look at the 100% residential burglary attendance policies, and they do reap dividends, but we also need to be mindful of whether the person who lives there is wanting that visit, and what impact it has on them. But I'm sure there are areas that Andy Cox and the crime team are looking at. So I'll kind of defer to Kerrin, because it's in her portfolio at the moment, as to where we're going with that one.
Thank you, Chief. We use the Thrive model to assess our attendance, which is the threat, harm, vulnerability, but also investigative opportunities. And it would be 99.9% of burglary residential where you would have investigative opportunities. It would be a very rare thing for it not to have that. So we would have some attendance, but whether that is a response attendance by a uniformed officer direct to a CID officer, or whether it's a forensic CSI crime scene investigator who would attend, it would depend upon what was the best resource to send to that particular burglary.
No, that's good. Thank you very much. So we move on to the next section.
Okay, I think Kerrin is going to continue with this, because it's the demand piece, I think.
Kerrin, before you start, Kerrin, I suppose what I'll do, I'll give you my question in advance, because then you'll probably pick it up as part of your presentation bit, because it's a fairly obvious one, which is we know that 101 and 999 are under national pressure, not just local pressure, and I'm particularly, I'm getting more concern from residents around the time it takes to get through and everything else. And I know there's a lot of work the force are doing, so it's sort of, I'm sure you were going to address that, but rather than me ask it afterwards, it's easier for me to sort of say, well, that's really what I'm after, is understanding where the force is at in trying to meet the demand in a very difficult space that it's in. I'll leave it with you.
Thank you, Commissioner. And exactly, that is the majority of our daily thinking is around the demand that comes in, how we respond, how we answer that demand, but also how we actually try and mitigate some of that demand that is coming through. As you've alluded to, nationally, all forces are seeing a massive increase in terms of the calls for service that are coming through. If I give you some just a flavour of what we were experiencing at the beginning of the year, or this time last year, we would experience around about 7,999 calls a month. That has increased to over 10,000 calls per month for the last 2 or 3 months. 101 calls have increased from 12,000 a month to 17,000 a month. So that's an extra 8,000 calls that we're dealing with the same level of resources, both within the control room to answer the calls and to officers to actually respond to those calls at a time of more complexity when the calls come in. What we try to do now, which we introduced with rigour last year, was the Thrive assessment, and is to make sure that when people do ring, although it might take them a little bit longer to get through, we are answering our calls within a reasonable time frame. But when they do ring, that they get the best service that they can on the phone, and we're not just answering a call and passing it on to the next person to actually take more details. We're taking as much detail as we can there and then, which is one of the challenges nationally that we're in discussions with the Beaten Crime Plan about league tables for quickly answering calls versus the quality of the calls that are being answered. So we may need to make sure that that pipeline is smooth. So that's just giving you a little bit of a flavour of the amount of volume that is coming into our control room. As you know, for the last year or so, we've a couple of years we've been working on the new command and control system, which will make the system a lot smoother to answer and give us some of the information when it comes through that we would ordinarily search through a number of different systems. So if you're a repeat caller or you're a vulnerable caller or in a vulnerable location, that should be able to pop up and have the call take identify that immediately, which will make the call handling time a lot slicker and enable us to tailor the response to be much better. That should have gone live, that command and control system should have gone live in June this year. There's bumps in the road, for want of a better word, around how that has progressed, and I've had some significant meetings with the chief execs within Motorola and Chief OS about our approach to make sure that we are on track and have a very tight grip of how we're approaching things with that. My expectation is that we will go live before the end of this calendar year on the command and control system. But I will keep the Commissioner's office very tightly updated in terms of the progress with those challenges. All of this means that we've got lots of churn within the control room of new staff coming in. Because of our Officer Uplift programme, we've got lots of people who work in the control room and elsewhere within the organisation who want to be police officers, and so we're constant churning of new staff, and so the training environment for new staff coming into the control room is quite significant, and this takes time to train, but it also has an impact on our resilience to answer as many calls as we can. What we have done in order to try and mitigate that is increase our resilience with the IRT, which is the initial resolution team. So there are some officers who might not be fully deployable on the front line, who are able to do some of that investigation in a remote way as opposed to attending an address for an individual. And we've got much more robust processes in place now to support officers to do that robust investigation. That is not stemming the flow on the calls coming in though. One of the things that we've done to try and stem the flow of the calls coming in is direct and divert people to use the online system. So the online crime reporting, which you will see has gone up by 50% in terms of that online crime reporting over the last 12 months. That has taken some of the calls away. But as you can see, that it doesn't take all of the calls away, but hopefully it gives people an easier opportunity for them to try and get their details across to us so that we can ring them back and make an appointment if we need to come and see them, or take that further investigation details over the telephone at the time that suits them. And as we see more and more people want to use online crime reporting, we need to get better and slicker at that to make sure that they get the service that they want in a way and a manner that suits their lifestyle. The additional piece in this, which comes in, is about our response times in terms of the calls for service. And as you will see on the graphs, the calls for service that have come in have gone up like this, but our response times of actually getting have the correlation is that they're getting slower. and that is purely because of the lack of resources to be able to meet the huge demand that has come in throughout the summer. But we are still getting there, and we have got processes in place to make sure that within our supervisory team that there are ringback systems to make sure that if we can't get there at our promised time, that we are able to at least keep people informed about when we are coming to address that. But the significant events that the Chief has mentioned already, that we've even seen this week with the Wisby car meet, etc., the terrible fire over at Inglemells, but some of the other tragic incidents that we've had, has meant that we've got quite a lot of scenes. And although I've mentioned about our scene guard resilience there, it doesn't cover everything. So we do end up having to take officers or PCSOs off some of those duties of responding to jobs to actually attend some of those scenes until we can manage our way through them. And they, because of the detail of the investigations, some of these complex investigations, it does take quite some time to get through. Sometimes we've had scene guards on for 3, 4, 5 days. So that is a picture that is the current here and now. But the picture is an improving picture. It's just that the plans take a long time to get through in terms of our training, our new command and control system, and the new Uplift programme that the Chief's already mentioned will have that difference. But we won't see the benefits of that probably until next year for the whole to come on board.
No, thank you for that. I suppose one question which links to something that you mentioned, which was around complexity, because I'm aware that complexity quite often leads to an increase of call time, both on 999 calls but also on 101 calls, and I think it would be useful for future reports to have that included in there, because I know that has been growing, and from memory I seem to think that the increase in 101 time is about an average of 1 minute 20 per call. So not only are you dealing with 5,000 more of them, but they're lasting an additional 1 minute 20, and I think I can't remember how many additional seconds on 9. So it'd be useful to reflect that. And I suppose the other element for me is the thought we probably need to give collectively on how we communicate some of this better to the public, because I think largely the public will be unaware, although I know I occasionally see an article in the local media about this, but I think some simple, easy to understand graphics that are maybe going out on a weekly basis, bi-weekly basis, that articulate just the sheer volume that we're getting, the different methods by which people can communicate and report things to the police might help, because I think it is important to take the public with us on that journey and get them to understand that, you know, quite simply, if you're dealing with an additional 7,000 calls and they're also taking more time as well, that it's not that you're not stepping up to the plate to deliver the best service you can. It's just, you know, you can only do so much with the resources available, and we need their help and support. And it's a bit similar to when you get winter demand in the NHS. They're very vocal in making clear to the public what the size and scale of the problem is and how the public can help them with that. And I think maybe there's a little bit more we can do to try and take the public with us on that. Chief, you want to come in?
Yeah, Commissioner, thank you, and I agree with that. I think we do need to get that message out there, but it's not just about why you would ring the police and how you can get information about the police. It's also about our partners. You know, of that 8,000, 9,000 extra calls that we're taking, a significant amount of them are about calls for service that other partners should be providing, and I think it's a knock-on effect of some, you know, just a downturn in service provision due to COVID and lockdown. But if I remember rightly, on the last set of figures, something like 23 to 25% of the calls coming into our control room are mental health related calls. Now, very few of those actually require police attendance. They actually require medical attendance, but that is a significant demand on our own call takers, and they are complex calls because of the nature of the incident that we're talking about. And I think you're about to do a piece and preparing a piece about the role of the police and crime against non-crime type incidents. But we need to be getting more out there to the public about this, but we also need to be working with our partners to say, what is it you're doing and what service can you offer, and how do people access your services if your call centres aren't open because you've still got social distancing happening and you're at 50% capacity. Where else can they get their information for your service? Because at the moment we seem to be the last port of call when people can't find the information from elsewhere.
No, I think that's a very, very fair point. I mean, we're very lucky in Lincolnshire that our partners are very open and willing to have conversation, but it's absolutely clear we can't pick up everybody's statutory responsibilities in the same way we wouldn't expect them to be picking up policing statutory responsibilities in that respect. It is a partnership approach we need, and it's not about abandoning people who are in crisis. It's the opposite. It's making sure the services they need are there when they need them, whatever those services are. And we've made some huge progress regarding mental health in particular, and I know that's coming up in the next section, but we've made huge strides. The number of people that are no longer being held in custody suites as a result of having a mental health need, the police have done a huge amount. Having mental health professionals working alongside us in the control room has made a huge difference. The triage vehicles, which don't have a police presence on them, again making a huge difference. So we are being good partners in this space. We do need others to do their bit though, and we've got some very good relationships in that space, and we do need to be having those quite often difficult conversations with them to make sure that they're doing their bit. And it is something that I know is on the radar of ministers as well. It's something that commissioners up and down the country and chief constables around the country are raising nationally, not just in Lincolnshire, because it is one of those things where if we're going to be clear that we want the police to be the front end for that, then it needs funding. Yeah, we can do it. It just needs funding, and we'll employ people that are appropriately and professionally trained to do that area of business. If not, then somebody else needs to have sufficient resource to be able to deal with that properly. But it's not okay just to expect services that haven't got trained professionals in a particular area just to pick it up. It's not good for the professionals. It's certainly not good for the people requiring service. So I'm totally with you on that. We've sort of almost covered off that next section around mental health. Whether there's anything else that we want to cover before that, we've got the road traffic collision section before we get to the mental health. But whether we just want to top and tail the mental health piece as we're halfway through it, is there anything else you'd want to say on that?
So just to cover the mental health piece, I agree with you. It's a lot of work to do with the partners, but I must say the partners, and particularly NHS partners and local authority, are very much behind this. And I met with NHS colleagues yesterday about trying to build better 136 provision across the county, particularly in the east of the county. And I think you're meeting with them in a couple of weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, Commissioner, as well. So there's a lot of work going on there, but it's all going to take time. And in the meantime, we've got to try and mitigate that demand coming in and the resources required to deal with it, because we do lose officers for hours and hours on end whilst dealing with mental health. And it's not just our control room, it's the impact on our officers. But overall, the impact at the moment, it looks like the mental health calls are coming down. Our 136 detainees are coming down. And I think some of that actually is a positive impact of coming out of lockdown, is that those tensions and pressures and the anxiety and the stresses that people felt by being locked down and locked in seem to be just easing a little bit. There are still points of anxiety and people who are anxious about coming back out. And I think we'll still see some of the mental health issues from lockdown for months to come yet. But there's certainly, it appears to be a positive news story, and that is easing and dropping off a little bit as time goes on.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we'll obviously keep in touch regarding that mental health work as we move forward. So if we move on to the section that's just before the mental health one, but after the one we were meant to be discussing, the road traffic collisions, I think it's just one of those that very sadly is a feature of all areas, but big rural counties such as Lincolnshire is something that's of particular challenge and tragedy for our community. So we'll cover that one off next if we can. Yeah,
there's not a lot more to add on that, to be honest, Commissioner. the picture is relatively static at the moment, but again starting to rise as people come back on the roads. We know this month and next month are going to be tough for us because of holiday makers coming in, and particularly motorcyclists, which seem to be disproportionately impacted upon by the types of road that we have. They're obviously quite attractive to motorcyclists, but actually that leads to higher levels and disproportionate levels of motorcyclists being involved in serious accidents. So we are starting to see it rise a little bit. 38 people over the past 12 months have lost their lives. That to me is 38 too many, but it is below where we would normally be. I think pre-COVID we were running at around about 50 to 55s per year. There's still a lot to do though around the serious accident and serious injury piece. So we have 374 in the last 12 months. Slight reduction, but probably in the normal bounds of where we would expect to be. And this is why the road policing unit is being developed, so that we have that dedicated presence on our roads, not just about road safety, but road crime, but also trying to protect people's lives. And we've obviously had the tragic incident last week on Wisley Road, where we've just got a gathering of young people coming together with their cars, unfortunately, has led to very, very serious injuries for some people there. And I would urge those young people to think about what they're doing and take responsibility for their own safety and their own actions, because those kind of incidents are eminently avoidable if people were aware of the dangers they were taking when they met like this, because sadly we've got 4 people who remain in hospital and 2 of whom are in a very serious condition. So I think that's all I'd say on that one, unless there's any questions on it.
Yeah, not so much questions, because I think we've got a clear roadmap as to where we're taking that work. It remains a priority of mine in the wider sense about sort of raising awareness of road safety, but also trying to reduce the amount of tragedy on our roads. And you know, we're now seeing, as we come out of COVID, the programme that we put in place for young drivers to do the advanced motorist test and training, that's building back up again now, which is great to see. My intention is to continue doing that. It's a great thing to get young drivers having that very different, not just learning to pass a test, but learning to drive. And I think that's a really important piece. And we'll continue to do what we can as well to try and link changes in behaviour, which I think is the key element. It's not about trying to charge people fines. It's about trying to get them to realise that actually if we're all better citizens to each other on the roads, then we'll all be safer and go home to our loved ones. And we're seeing that through the expansion of the community speed watch scheme, which will continue to develop, and that's working really well. This Safer Together Roads team are a hugely important part of that work as well, which obviously is the policing element. But we want to do as much as we can to try and change driver behaviour rather than anything else, because if we can do that, then we'll be winning on it. So there's a number of different areas we're all working in together on this through the road safety partnership, and I just think we've just got to keep doing what we can to keep affecting those numbers. But it's not lost on me that 15 years ago the numbers were double what they are now. You know, it's a significant, although it's a horrible number that we're looking at from killed and seriously injured, it is less than half of what it was 15 years ago. And part of that is to do with technology changes in vehicles, that they are safer, but it is partly down to the fact that the partnership has worked very effectively to try and keep people safer on Lincolnshire's roads. So I'll pass back over to you then for the next section. We've obviously done the mental health piece, but that would sort of take us on to the sort of other elements of that next section around CSE, domestic abuse, rape, etc.
Okay, thank you. I think I'm starting with this piece and then I'll hand over to Kerrin in a moment. But the first part is really about the protect piece and about whether we're getting the right report, number of reports in, and the referrals into relevant agencies and multi-agency teams. So you can see on the first slide, child sexual abuse continues to rise. Our referrals are increasing, but that is a good thing, because it means we're looking after those children who are being exploited. But what we're seeing continually is a rise in referrals from the National Crime Agency now, particularly around child sexual abuse with exploitation. So significant harm here to these young people, and a growing number of offences being identified, largely because there's more being reported, but also because our techniques to investigate this are improving, and our investment in digital investigation and online investigation is improving as well. You can see that in terms of domestic violence, the number of referrals into the Domestic Abuse Safeguarding Hub has increased slightly, which again is good news, because that's more people getting the help that they require. And at the same time, in terms of those who have been assessed as being at high risk of harm, has fallen by just over 16%. So whilst we're seeing the increase, actually the risk of harm is reducing, or the nature of the harm to those individuals is reducing. And there's a lot of preventative work, as we've mentioned before, around violence against women and girls, because it tends to be, domestic violence tends to be predominantly female victims. And the rapes we've touched on before, they remain relatively static, to be honest. But we've got a big action plan being put in place to improve not just reporting, but recording and our investigation processes. And as we go through those, you'll see that the numbers that are coming through, but the commentary behind rapes is that we continue to work on the safeguarding elements around domestic violence advisors and child sexual violence advisors. But from a rate point of view, we've increased our prosecution rate by just over 300% in the last 6 months. And we're continuing to see rises in that, with an increase from 1.27% to 5.4% for all rapes being prosecuted. There's still a lot to do, because I know people will say 5.4% is still very low, but it's almost double the national average at the moment, and improving, and a step change in how we were approaching it a few months ago. So Andy Cox and his team have done a fantastic job there. And I've mentioned the referral to domestic abuse services. That's up now by 600% from the previous year. And we continue to work with all our partners on that, because that is a highly effective and productive team that makes a massive difference to the victims of domestic abuse. And the Operation Hydrant, which is a national operation in respect of child sexual abuse, continues, and we continue to respond to that, particularly in response to the Everyone's Invited website. And again, partners are heavily involved in that side of things. The final bit there is about our hate crime, and hate crime has remained relatively static. And if you look at the figures there, they're very low figures. So whilst the chart itself seems to bounce around all over the place, it is because it's got very low figures in there, and it stays normally within those statistical bounds. And you'll see no real change over the past 12 months. And at the moment, we're just slightly above the seasonally expected based on the previous 3 years. But as I say, they're very small numbers, and 63% of those are about racial hate crime. One of the areas we are just looking at is, as football season has started again, is the racial elements of antisocial behaviour and hatred that was evidenced at the I think it was the Bolton match last weekend. And we're working very closely with Lincoln Football Club to just make sure that we try and stamp that out. And I know the football club are very, very proactive on this element. So there's work going on around that as well. But there's still further work to do around identifying and understanding our communities and how this is impacting on them. But overall, it's a relatively static picture on that one.
No, thank you for that. I mean, certainly with domestic abuse and rape, one of the things that's quite difficult is to try and understand the numbers, because we understand that these areas are exceedingly complicated, and we know that we don't get to see 100% of the picture. I mean, burglary as an example, most people, I've got a high level of confidence that if your house gets burgled, you're going to tell the police. So we're pretty sure the stats are as accurate as they're likely to ever be. I think we're always pushing to try and get more reporting in certain crime areas, whether it's hate crime, rape, whether it's domestic abuse. We want people to come forward and report. And one of the challenges then is understanding how true a picture we've got of what's actually going on, and that I understand that's always going to be a challenge. One of the things that's also difficult is understanding when you talk about the percentage that's then able to be taken forward for a court process, is obviously there's an amount of people that don't wish to support that process, and it could be that they don't want to take that forward because they don't have confidence in the system. It could equally be that they just don't want to do it for a number of other reasons, and particularly with domestic abuse, it's quite difficult to understand what percentage aren't being taken forward because we don't believe we've got enough evidence, or because, you know, the case isn't there, or because we can't get, you know, the person that has experienced the crime to actually follow the process through. And I don't know whether that's something we monitor separately, whether that would, how that data is processed to be able to understand that picture a little bit more. Kerrin, you wanted to come in?
Yes, thanks, Commissioner. And that very question that you've just posed is something that we've been grappling with very recently. So one of the things that we've put in place is through the CPS and ourselves is a joint action plan, which has come from the national guidance about a national action plan about how we tackle rape and sexual offences. And one of the areas that we've looked at are why people don't follow through. So if they've made an initial report to us, you would think that somebody does want the police to take action, but there's a huge array of reasons why people may not take action, but it's not captured particularly well. It's all anecdotal. So what we've started to do now, which we've just put in place in the last few weeks, is developing an for want of a better term, an exit interview. So if somebody is withdrawing, rather than just accepting that they don't want to take it any further forward, is actually have somebody visit them and go through what were the challenges, what were the hurdles, what made it difficult for them, because it may well be something completely outside of any of the agency's remit. It might be a lifestyle consideration for them. But if it's something that is because the agencies, whether it's victim service, the police or the criminal justice agencies, could have done differently or better, then that's something that we can't particularly fix. So that's what we're looking at, so that we get a better picture at that, and then we can hopefully develop some strategies to enable, if it is something that we can control, that we can keep people on side with, so that we can give them the justice that they're seeking when they first pick up the phone and call us. And just in relation to people contacting the police to report rapes, domestic abuse or sexual violence, that isn't always the case. We still have crime figures which are there, and an individual may not have wanted the police to be notified, and it might have come through a third party if they've gone to their GP, their doctor, or somebody else, or they've gone through some support services, and they may have disclosed something that other agencies are obliged to report to the police, and that victim or survivor may not have wanted police contact in the first place. So we also have to be respectful for what their wishes are. And they may not have always set out to have a criminal justice outcome.
No, I totally understand that, and it makes eminent sense. I think what doesn't come through in the debate about what does good look like in this space, because what it looks like when they say, well, national figures are around 2%, well, it looks like policing fails 98% of the time, and that's clearly not the case. And we need to understand because we want people to have confidence in reporting. And if one of the barriers to confidence is the fact that they feel that 98% of the time there's a failure, then that will prevent other people reporting, and we need to be able to present as true a picture as possible about the reality of what's going on. And I think some of that, we know that crime recording systems in recent years have changed and have changed the way these figures look. So it's just about presenting a true picture so that we can improve services, both on the policing side, but also on the victim side and the witness care and criminal justice, but also actually that we're presenting a genuine, honest picture to the public to give them confidence. Because at the moment, I just think it's muddy, and that's not helpful, because I think we're probably getting it right for an awful lot more people than the figures suggest, and I think that needs to come through. And that's not a Lincolnshire issue so much as a national one, but it is certainly something that we want to do. The other thing around hate crime in particular, we know, again, massively underreported, and it's one of those where we need to try and, not just through policing, but through the OPCC and partners, try and raise awareness of the importance of reporting, and in particular, not because it's more important than the other protected characteristics, but just because of the demographic involved. I'm particularly keen to work around disability hate crime, because I'm not confident that it's as easy for people to always navigate the system to get to report, and depending what the disability is, obviously, and I'm not sure whether we're getting a true picture on some of these areas. So that's something that I'm keen to do more with partners, to actually understand how we can work better together to access different groups across our community, to say, look, our services need to be tailored to support you if you are a victim survivor of crime, but also to help you report it, we need to make sure that it's accessible. And I know that's something you'd obviously be keen to support, but it's something that I feel that we really need to do a bit more with. Chief?
Yeah, thank you. Just on that, Commissioner, Mel Cowell, our diversity lead, is looking at our methods of communication and access to our systems, whether that's about sign language or whether it's about the kind of touch type and here and different systems, and just making it easier for people with disabilities to actually get in touch with us, because that may be physically or mentally, what support do we need to put in place to help those people, because actually in this day and age, with the way technology has improved, we should be able to offer many more opportunities for people with disabilities to actually access policing. And I know Mel Cowell's doing a huge piece of work on that. We are trying to build our diversity, equality and inclusion team. At the moment it is Mel. The plan is to, I think we're looking to build 3 or 4 additional people into that team. We're just going through job descriptions at the moment, and grading, and hopefully those roles will get advertised in the very near future. But I don't think we invest enough in this part. I said it when I came for my interview for the job, was I think we invest something like 0.07% of our budget on our diversity, equality and inclusion team and our effort there. That is not appropriate for a force of this size. We need to invest more in that, and we need to get this piece right. And that's where that investment is going to come. But there is work going on while we build that team through Mel, and she's doing a phenomenal amount of work to try and make it happen.
No, and I fully back you in what your aims and objectives are with that, and obviously anything we can do to support Mel's work, whether that's supporting events with different groups, or whether they're focus groups, whether it's sort of working with the Safer Together team to do outreach into community. We've got that ability to help and support, and we're very keen to do that. So we can work together on that. Kerrin?
Yeah, just one piece of work in terms of that just potential disproportionality from all minority and protected characteristics coming through that we're working on within the region, within the local criminal justice board, is a task and finish group in terms of that proportionality. not just about reporting, but how people are treated once they are in the system, either as victims or offenders, if they've got protected characteristics. And I know your team within the OPCC is part of that group as well, but looking at the learning from other forces in this region as well about how we can do better.
Yeah, it is really important. I mean, one of the things I'm really keen to do is make sure that our services are fit for all members of our community, and that is regardless of whether they've got protected characteristics under the Equality Act or they haven't. We need to make sure that the services people receive are fit for purpose when they need them, where they need them. So that's something we should always have under review, and it's something that we need to make sure we get right. So I know it's something that we build in as we commission new services, but anything we can work together on with that, very keen to do so. So moving on then, next section around process.
Yeah, I'll cover this one quickly, and then I think Kerrin will then pick up the next section on outcomes. So process, this really only covers two parts. It's the forensics attendance and positive outcome from it, and the stop and search. Forensics, you can see there's a slight drop off in terms of those that we've attended in the past month, and the rolling average over the 12 months is very, very slightly up. 2.5% to 3% is fairly normal for police forces in terms of crime scene attendance. You have to bear in mind that not all crimes will have forensic opportunities, nor would it be proportionate to the investigation either, because it's an expensive and very technical process that has to be gone through. So that feels about right. The idents coming from the past month, obviously up at 38.5% compared to our normal 28%. So that slight drop off in attendance has led to a higher rate of return. But I would say in the past month, actually, a lot of this has been down to the nature of incidents we've gone to, which have been highly complicated and complex. So these will be homicides, and some of our crime scenes, serious crime scenes, as well as our serious collisions and fatal collisions. So they're things that we just need to be mindful of, because they all take away our CSI availability and accessibility to these crimes, and has an impact on what we can and can't attend. Stop and search rates, our total number of stop and search is very low, I think, for a force of our size. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, because there's still a lot of work going on to identify whether stop and search has a positive impact or otherwise on crime. I think when it comes to violent crime, weapons and so on, it definitely does. And it appears that given the arrest rate that we've got at 17% for the previous month and 15%, we're targeting the right people, because that, if I remember rightly from my previous roles, is quite high. Most forces are normally down in the single percentage figures in terms of percentage arrests. So that targeted and intelligence-driven stop and search seems to be working well. The concern I would have, though, as is said in the commentary at the end of this, is we still see a disproportionality with stop and search with Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. So not quite double what you would see for our white populations, but it is still disproportionate. And we're just working that through with the external scrutiny from the independent advisory group, and we're working through Her Majesty's Inspectorate report on disproportionate use of police powers to make sure that we're working closely with that as well, so that we better understand why we've got that disproportionality and what we can do to address it. Again, what I'd say is that the disproportionality levels in Lincolnshire are significantly lower than those you would see elsewhere in the country, but they're still a cause for concern, and we need to understand it better and work it through.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this has been an area where we've got the independent advisory group supporting the force on this, which obviously gives an additional layer of comfort that you've got that external support looking at that. I mean, it's one of those where it's quite difficult, because we've got in Lincolnshire very low numbers of people from a Black and ethnic minority background. So you know, a very low number of additional or fewer searches skews a percentage massively in this space. So I think it's absolutely right that the force is continually reviewing this and looking at it, and I've got every confidence in your process to do that. But you know, it is one of those where percentages can alter very quickly, can't they, with this kind of number set? Because if we were looking at you know, the West Midlands volume, then it would look very different with their demographic as opposed to our demographic. Because arguably, if you looked at this on paper, you'd say, well, hang on, you've stopped 628 white British people and only arrested 94 of them, which is a lower number than you would put against other areas with different characteristics. So you know, I don't claim to have an answer to that. I think your approach is right. It's keeping it under review. It's using the IAG. You're engaging external bodies to make sure we're getting it right. And I just fully support the approach you're taking with that, really.
And Commissioner, I think if I remember rightly, and Kerrin hopefully will support me on this, is when we looked at some of these figures, you're right. So the disproportionality is bounced very quickly by one or two incidents. And I think just after I arrived, it spiked because we'd stopped a vehicle with 5 young black men in. I think all of those ended up being arrested. They'd come from out of county. And actually, when we look at our black and Asian minority ethnic groups, I think a large proportion of those are people who are non-resident in Lincolnshire and have been stopped based on intelligence. So that again skews our figures from a population point of view. But it still doesn't explain why we have that disproportionality, because there will be white people who are coming in to commit crime and who are linked to organised crime groups as well. So that's the part we need to understand better.
Yeah, and like I say, I totally support that approach. I think it's a very sensible approach, and you know, it's right that we can be clear with the public in a narrative sense about not just why we're stopping and searching people, but also the approach you're taking to making sure that you're getting it right. I think that's really important, and you know, if the way it's been articulated, I think is a very clear narrative around that, and that's important. So moving on then to outcomes.
Kerrin, I think you'll
take that one, Chief. Okay, thank you. So on the outcomes, one of the things that I want to highlight initially is the implementation of a new focus that we have on outcomes, which is around the Crime Standards Board. So we've got a new Detective Superintendent who started with us in June. And we've created a new board with the terms of reference on to get the same standards and quality right across the whole of the force, rather than different people working in disparate ways. The Crime Standards Board is looking at both the quality of investigations, the outcomes, the training and professional development of investigators, whether they're uniform investigators or CID or specialist investigators, to make sure that we've got the same standards all the way across. And the outcomes and positive outcomes is one of the particular areas that we are looking at. As you'll see that we're at around about 13.5% of a positive outcome rate. And again, it's about unpicking each of those individual outcomes to see what are we good at and what can we do better at by sharing best practice right across the whole of the force area. And as we've seen for rape outcomes, and we've already talked about them, the percentage is very, very low. So we need to understand what are we doing well, what are we not doing well, and how can we address some of those particular hiccups in the road. Lots of it is around the technical side of things, about not having the backlogs that we have within drug testing, and because we have to outsource some of our forensic testing, some of it may well be about the complexity of analysing mobile phone data and other digital evidence and getting the skills up for that, and also having the kit and equipment. We're just refreshing our telephone kiosks to get better and quicker kit and equipment, so that we can analyse the evidence that comes in, so that we've got a better chance of providing that case to CPS and the courts. So I'm really excited about bringing this together and seeing where this takes us. So hopefully we'll be able to give you a much more positive outcome about the direction of travel on that on the next meeting. Within the criminal justice side, however, we are working with our partners across the whole of the criminal justice board. So the local criminal justice board with the other agencies, the courts, the CPS, etc., to understand what the whole pandemic has had as an impact across all of us. We've got the magistrates backlog back on track now, to a reasonable amount of backlogs on the trials, but our main concern is around the Crown Court trials. Because of the complexities and certainly some of the positive investigations that we've been doing, where we've taken out whole criminal gangs, where you've got 6 and 7 people who are facing trial. It's not as easy to have all of those people with all of their barristers and all of the other entourage that would come into some of our courtrooms, which are quite antiquated and not fit for having multi-handed trials in a pandemic, where we still need to have those measures in place, social distancing. So that there is that's some of the reasons why the backlogs in Crown Court trials have been really problematic to actually work through, both nationally and locally. And we have we are securing some court time and court spaces for Crown Courts outside of the region, outside of the county, to make sure that we've got some of those backlogs going through. But it is a challenge that, certainly from a police perspective, that we're constantly pushing towards our other partners in the courts to try and manage. Within one of the knock-on effects to that is the witness care unit, and we have invested more resources in the witness care unit because people are waiting potentially another a year up to the Crown Court trials going ahead, and therefore we need to make sure that our witnesses are still looked after, still updated and informed, etc. But that's a lot more work on our witness care unit, so I've put some additional resources into that. There has been a national funding pot for witness care victims and witnesses that has come about, and we've been able to access some of the funding from that to be able to supplement the staff who are in there. And what we have seen as a result of that is that we've got a lot more people who are staying on board and sticking with us. And anybody out there who's listening to this, if you are part of that process and you are a witness in there, then please just stick with it. We will get there, because we are seeing some very, very good results in terms of the trials that are coming up within the Crown Court. And we've seen that on the news recently about a child protection case for 2 sex offenders who've recently been given over 20 years as a collective. But that's a 4-year case that we've been working through. So these things, which are complicated, take their time to work through. I'll pause there if there's any questions on the outcomes in the courts before I go on to the driving enforcement and firearms licensing piece, Commissioner, if there was anything you wanted.
No, not specifically question wise. I mean, it's obviously an area of concern which we're raising nationally with ministers all the time, and they're very keen to support everywhere to resolve this. I mean, it's regrettable that Lincolnshire didn't benefit from a Nightingale court, which some areas did. In fact, the East Midlands really struggled to get extra court capacity, which was unfortunate. But, you know, hopefully we will start to sort of see that come through. And we know it's obviously some of the more complex cases that have been delayed, so that's going to take a bit of time to work through. And that as well has a knock-on effect on police time, particularly if they're going out of county. Then we've obviously got to go to wherever we need to give evidence, unless it can be done remotely. So it's a real challenge, but it's just one of those I think we're just going to have to persevere with. And as you say, the more investment we can keep leveraging from the centre to support witness care will help, and we'll keep doing that. But no, nothing to question on that.
Okay, thank you. I'll move on to the driving enforcement side of things then. I know we've talked earlier about the road traffic collisions and the care killed and seriously injured on our roads, and I think just highlighting some of the figures there will give some confidence that although we don't have our roads policing team up and running yet. We are still making sure that we're tackling the fatal 4 issues across the rest of our resources within both specialist ops and our response and neighbourhood teams, and the specials for their team as well. So drug driving arrests, on average 120 arrests in this county for people who are abusing drugs or alcohol whilst driving, and that for me is quite significant. They're just the people that we stop and arrest, let alone how many other people are transgressing, and then we wonder why we've got so many accidents on our roads. It's just unbelievable that we have that many people who still abuse drugs and alcohol whilst driving and don't seem to consider the consequences. The other thing that I just want to flag up is the amount of vehicles that we seize each month, which generally are uninsured vehicles. 187 on average a month vehicles are seized. So those are just 2 data sets to prove that we are working and still really focused on our roads policing activity to try and make the roads as safe as we can for the drivers who legitimately use the roads in our county. The Operation Snap, which we launched a few months back now, has gone really well. We've had over 200 submissions on Operation Snap, and some of those submissions have resulted in warnings, but we have had 67 prosecutions as outcomes for that. So that is the public identifying poor driver behaviour, recording it on their dash cams and sending it through to us in a very easy way, in terms of just logging online, sending it through to us, and then we'll take it from there and deal with it as we should do. But this ensures that people who see that bad behaviour, you know yourself, you'll get frustrated when you see somebody pull out in front of you or do something crazy on the roads. You're able to do something about it and take that responsibility forward. One of the questions that constantly come to us, though, is that they might have seen somebody speeding past them, or somebody speeding on the roads, and they've caught it on their dash cam, and why we can't prosecute that. We can't prosecute that because we need to actually prove the speed, and to prove the speed for our police vehicles, we need a calibration, and we need that scientific accreditation about the speedometers that we use to make sure that we've got that evidence nailed on if we are taking people to court. And that can't happen just because your speedometer says that that person was going faster than you and you were doing 70. That's not evidence for court standards. But it's still a really good news piece on there. And then finally, on the firearms licensing piece, you'll see there that we're still really excellent nationally and one of the top performing forces in terms of how we approach our firearms licensing, to make sure that the 60,000 legally held firearms in our county are legally held, and that each of those individuals who have the certificates are going through a robust process. We've had the terrible events in Plymouth and the shooting earlier this month, and it was absolutely tragic to see. And we've gone back and we've reviewed what we're doing to make sure, is there anything else that we can do? Are there any social media accounts, etc., and how do we actually approach that? I've been reassured by my team that where there are higher degrees of risk for individuals, we will check through social media accounts where we can, but not everybody has a social media account with just your name on it. So Kerrin Wilson, any social media accounts that I have in my name are easily found, but if I'm calling myself something Mickey Mouse, or for instance, then that is not quite so easily found, and we don't have any legal requirement for license holders to give us that information. What we're looking at doing is putting in process a voluntary piece where we can get people to identify their social media accounts, so we will do that as a matter of course. We are still waiting, however, for the Home Office to produce some guidance about how we might be able to bring this into more of a rigorous way forward for all forces, so that we have the same standard across the forces as to what we might do. And I think that's all I had to cover on that, if there was any questions or comments, Commissioner.
Okay. The vehicle seized one is a fascinating one, because obviously it shows a high level of proactivity on behalf of the police, which is brilliant. It shows a high level of irresponsible behaviour on behalf of a certain element of the driving public, which isn't so great. And when we look at the insurance as a particular area, we obviously introduced Operation Tutelage, which was using the ANPR system to identify vehicles from Lincolnshire that were on our roads. Is that still being used to the same extent it was? Because the reason I ask is I would have expected to see a reduction in the number of vehicles seized for no insurance, given that the early indications from Operation Tutelage were that it was being a huge success. So there seems to have been no correlation whatsoever between the success of getting vehicles insured through Operation Tutelage and then the number of vehicles seized, which is quite an interesting dynamic. So I'm not really sure if we've looked at why that might be. The other question I'll just give you while I've got it in my head is around the firearms licensing, I suppose. Lincolnshire has always it's enjoyed a very responsible gun ownership group of people. I mean, it's a huge fraternity, about 22,000 people across Lincolnshire that hold firearms, and largely very responsible. And we've got a very robust process. First place to have the online system, the first place to obviously have the more mandatory process around the GPs, even when guidance from the Home Office was lacklustre around that particular area. So we've always been at the forefront of dealing with this very appropriately, fairly, but robustly on behalf of the public's safety, and indeed the safety of those that own firearms. What I don't really want to see nationally is a massive knee-jerk reaction to suddenly say, well, policing suddenly needs to police social media for all the reasons you've just outlined, because it's just not practical. And actually, is it proportionate, would be my other question. As much as I would wholeheartedly agree the incident that happened in Plymouth is just heartbreaking and tragic, we equally had the situation in Wisby the other day that was heartbreaking and tragic. And nobody's suggesting that we should, as part of issuing driving licenses, be trawling through everybody's social media accounts to see whether they're likely to drive quickly, irresponsibly, etc., etc. It would be disproportionate. And so I'm keen that as part of the debate nationally, I think PCCs will probably look to support the review into the guidance with some kind of national survey and some work in that. And I just want to not see a lurch reaction from one extreme to another, because I think largely we've got a very responsible gun ownership in our country and in our county, and a really robust police process when it works, as it does in Lincolnshire, to back that up. So I think it's right we review it. I just don't want it to be perceived as being it's all broken and not performing. What I would quite like is full cost recovery for the issuing of licenses. That might be a good start, because obviously that is set by the Home Office, so I'd hope that gets reviewed. But I think Lincolnshire, I would assert, is the best in the country at this, because as we know, how to put it delicately, it depends when you enter the paperwork onto the system as to how good or bad you look in a league table. And we know that we enter it at the earliest possible opportunity, so we know that our outcomes are accurate. I'll say no more than that, but I would assert we're the best end-to-end process of anywhere in the country in that, and we should be commended for that. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Commissioner. I'll let Kerrin come back about op tutelage. She will have more knowledge of the history of it than I do. But in relation to that last point about social media checks, I agree with you. I think there needs to be an open and frank debate about whether it's proportionate to what we're trying to do. The cost of trying to look at 60,000, well, it's not 60,000 users, but we have 60,000 licenses every year that we need to be, or firearms that we need to be licensing, and what impact that has and for what benefit. I think we also need to be really mindful that going and trawling people's social media when there is no obvious risk or threat posed by them is actually a breach of their privacy, and can be highly intrusive, because although I'm not a great social media user, people do have an awful lot of their personal data on there about their family, their friends, their activities. And is that proportionate for what we're trying to achieve here? And under what authority would we be doing it when there's no obvious threat and risk from somebody who presents as a very sound and rational individual who happens to own a firearm for social purposes or even for business purposes? We need to have that debate, and unfortunately I think this debate has already been had, and there are reports within the Home Office that have been sat there for nearly 2-3 years waiting to see the light of day, and we're as yet unsighted on what the outcome of those conversations have been.
And just to finish off on op tutelage, Commissioner, we do still use op tutelage, and I shall bring back to the next assurance meeting a bit more of an update on the figures and the direction of travel on that. I don't have that to hand, but I think one of the things that we can potentially have a look at is how we're educating the wider public on that particular piece. So I know it's gone off the boil in terms of any newsworthiness. It was there when we first launched it, but it's not there now, and it might help influence, educate and inform people that we are out there and that we are taking vehicles off the road because of the lack of insurance, and people will be prosecuted, and it might just make people think twice about driving on a road without insurance.
No, thank you for that, and I think it might be an interesting area to look at, not in a ridiculous amount of depth, but just to understand, because from a public point of view, I often get questions about, well, what do you do with the vehicles? Who pays for them? Where do they go? If they're proceeds of crime, can you sell them? If so, where do you sell them? So there's a whole raft of questions the public generally have around this kind of area that would be quite interesting, I think, to be able to explain as part of that. So that'd be really helpful. Thank you. So moving on to satisfaction.
Okay, I'll pick this one up. I think this is an area where I think the blunt way of putting it is it's a little bit disappointing. And I say that because the force have put an awful lot of work into this, about changing the way we keep people informed, the referrals that we make to appropriate safeguarding hubs and victim care processes and teams that we've already spoken about before. There's a lot of work gone into violence and rape and those areas where we do see people who are probably most dissatisfied. And it's normally around the being kept informed or the outcomes part. And we know that COVID has had an impact on that because we're not getting people to court and there's been delays in that. But as Kerrin's already mentioned, we're doing a lot of work to try and keep people updated on that and to keep them on board with those prosecutions. So we're going to go back and just have a look at what we put in place over the past year, how that's been implemented, whether there's any learning from that, what the data is telling us, and whether we can just kind of refresh some of that coming through. At the moment, as I say, it's just a little bit disappointing that despite all of the efforts we've put in place, we haven't seen the uplift in performance, but we have to take some account that the social environment may be playing into that, and other factors around delays in court processes and remoteness may also be having an influence. But we need to work that one through, and you'll see it's kind of mirrored in the complaints piece. Not too worried about complaints, although there is a slight rise towards the end of in the last 2 or 3 months. But the predominant factor in there is about outcomes. So again, are we investigating? Are we updating people? And are people aware of what we've done to try and resolve their cases? I think the two are linked very closely together. And Kerrin, I know, is going to be taking that forward and working that through in due course. Interestingly, restorative justice, you see the figures there and the satisfaction levels there, which have always been really, really high. At the 100%, everybody who goes in there is satisfied with what happens. We know that we haven't been doing this since I think it was March last year because of COVID, and obviously trying to kickstart that again and make it happen again. And the referral process, we're going to go to an automatic referral scheme for burglary and violence. So that risk assessment process that drops some people out for referral may not be quite so rigid and inflexible. And I know, Commissioner, that's something that's run by the Police and Crime Commissioner and your office, but it seems to have very positive outcomes there. And the sooner we kind of get that back up and running, the better, I think, now that we've got the freedom to do some of that again. But overall, I think I'm a little bit disappointed with this piece. It's not for want of trying, and we've just got to go back and review, refresh, and take some learning from it.
Yeah, I would share that assessment really, and obviously there will be a plethora of things people do around the country that are good, bad, and indifferent. And I guess it's understanding what will work here in Lincolnshire, and I'm sure you'll be reflecting on what might have worked elsewhere that we can pick up and learn from. But you know, it'd be great to obviously get those figures moving in a more positive direction. I mean, with the restorative justice, I mean, obviously it once people do enter into it, we know that it's a victim survivor focused service, and it's great to see that the people that go through it are seeing that level of value from it. What we will need to do is understand the implications of the referral mechanism change that you mentioned, because obviously that will have a volume implication which potentially affects the contract that's in place. It's understanding whether it can cope with that, etc., etc. So by no means am I saying it's a bad thing. It's just it would be useful if it's not already being done, which it may well already be happening behind the scenes where all these things are joining up seamlessly. But if not, then we need to just make sure that you know, our partnerships delivery manager on my side is understanding the implications of that, so that we know that they've got the right resources and things. But that's not to say it's a bad thing. I think the more people that have opportunity to decide whether restorative justice process is for them, the better, because I think that's the key. It's got to be arrived at by them with all the facts, hasn't it, as to whether it will be the right thing for them. And it's the other thing as well is to make clear that it's not a disposal outcome, because quite often it's misunderstood that actually it's instead of putting a perpetrator through a process, which obviously isn't the purpose. And I think that's sometimes misunderstood, that it's in some way instead of whatever would have happened to resolve it, rather than it being an additional benefit to the victim or survivor of a crime. No, that's all good. And then am I right in thinking that takes us up to resources?
Yeah, and I'll cover this one relatively quickly because I think we touched on a bit of it in the focus paper around police officer uplift. You can see the current picture around total strength as of the 31st of July, sorry. We're currently at 1,118 officers. I'm not going to worry too much about the 0.18. I'm not quite sure what 0.18 of an officer looks like, but that's what we're at. 937 of those are deployable. Obviously not all of those are in response. They're split across all of the roles that we have, and it's all ranks. The bits that are probably worth looking at is the absence levels at the moment. You can see that there's a rise in working days lost for police officers and police staff, including PCSOs. We have, since lockdown, suffered because of track and trace and a rise in infections amongst our own officers and staff, despite, I think, pretty much everybody now being vaccinated across the organisation. And obviously, even if they aren't infected but they're caught on track and trace, they've had to go into isolation. Changing those rules and regulations recently has helped and will help, so we'd expect that to come down. I think the other bit that I am going to recognise here as part of this public meeting is our officers and staff have worked pretty much non-stop for 18 months without a break. They've had additional COVID legislation to deal with it throughout that period. And that's changed on a regular basis, not just the regulations and the law, but the guidance that we've then had to interpret. And they've had to do this without really any holidays, any breaks, and we've asked them to work rest days and lots of overtime in order to cover for gaps that we've had because of those kind of abstractions. And I just want to thank all of them for doing what they do and just putting themselves out there to protect the public despite the risk to themselves, not just of violence that we spoke about earlier, but the risk of infection. And that goes to our colleagues in emergency service sector and public sector as well, in the public health sector. But I also think that that's now going to play out a little bit in terms of exhaustion and fatigue and maybe some minor rises in sickness for those kind of categories. And it is something through our health and wellbeing at work that we are monitoring and trying to keep track of. But it's something that we just need to be mindful of. And recruitment, I think we've covered that in terms of the cohorts in the police officer uplift. We're accelerating that programme. We're currently just looking at whether we can increase it a little bit further to 40 students per cohort, so that we buy us, as I mentioned earlier, we buy ourselves a little bit of time between the end of our IPLDP recruitment process to moving to PEQF, so that we just have a bit of a leeway and some flex in the system while we get PEQF up and running. And that's it, Commissioner.
Okay, well, thank you very much for running us through that. There's quite a lot to go through there, but I think it's important to do so. One thing that I was going to mention, which we may well discuss offline, is we obviously touched on assaults on officers. It might be a good idea to include some element around that within the report moving forward, so that we've got a sort of a place to actually monitor and discuss that and put a public face, if you like, to what the reality is around that. But you know, we don't need to discuss and debate that today. You can let me know your thoughts offline if you wish.
So I'll do that, Commissioner. But there's I'm meeting with the magistrates on, I think, on the 2nd of October at their annual training or one of their annual training days, and I'm going to take some of the stats to that meeting, say this is what we're facing. So as and when those stats are available and the reports are available, I'll share that with you as well at the same time.
I will also be joining you on that day as well. So I will get to see it there too.
Excellent. Good.
But no, other than that, just to say thank you very much for your attendance today and all of your good work, not just from yourselves, but from the organisation as a whole. I know it's been an exceedingly trying time and continues to be so, not least of which for the volume of calls for service for the public. So on their behalf, thank you. And Aubrey, do we have a date for the next meeting?
The next meeting is scheduled for the 25th of November.
There we are, 25th of November. So thank you everybody who has joined us today, and just to say we will see you in November, but thank you everybody for attending.